Modern American History course. This is Don De Angelo for Grossmont College and for Maricosta College. So we're going to get into the New Frontier and the Great Society programs of the 1960s. This is the administrations of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, usually referred to as JFK and LBJ. And we get into what a lot of historians will refer to as contemporary American history. And the context of this, of course, is that for most historians alive today, they were alive when these events happened. I'm born in 1963, so we start to get into my contemporary history. And whenever we do this, we always want to be careful, right? That no matter how hard I try, I still have an opinion, and it's sometimes easy to read what that opinion is and whatever. And I think everybody does that. It's just human nature. And so I always give a cautionary note to students to just treat my feedback, my observations that I make about things for exactly what they are. My opinion, my take on things, not only based on what I've read and what I've studied, but what I witnessed and what I experienced. And so it's a much different perspective on a historical reality. And you always want to take that to account. So similarly, this one of our authors here, I believe this is George Tindall, is to remember that he's not only alive at the time, but he's in college at the time, which puts him in the sort of the countercultural perspective, which is again a valuable one, but you have to take that along with mine and along with your colleagues and along with your parents and other people that you interact, and allow all of that to be part of your assessment of the historical reality, right? So if you want, you can listen to his perspective, which is, of course, that John F. Kennedy was a reluctant participant in the emerging civil rights movement. He was reluctant for two reasons. First, he was preoccupied with international crises and foreign policy that definitely got dumped on him. And the second, of course, was that the Democratic Party still relied heavily on the Southern Democrats. And I'll show you in a minute just exactly what that meant. And the Southern Democrats were, of course, very resistant, in fact, openly hostile to civil rights legislation, as they'd proven repeatedly. So civil rights leaders, however, like Martin Luther King Jr. and many others, took it upon themselves to organize demonstrations in the South, to demonstrations that ultimately triggered violent reactions, including by the police in southern cities such as Birmingham, and we'll talk about that. And those incidents are going to force JFK and his brother Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, to use the force of the federal government to get justice done for African Americans. So as you can see in this electoral map from the 1960 election, Democrats desperately needed those Southern Democratic votes. And Kennedy knows full on when he gets this result that that Southern Democratic vote was critical to his success, and we'll talk about how that plays out in the historical reality that's there. In the 1960 election, Vice President Nixon was nominated for the presidency for the Republican Party, and the Democrats chose John F. Kennedy, and he was not really the expected candidate. He was very young compared to the other competitors. In fact, he's the youngest man elected president until, I believe, Bill Clinton. But he was actually a very sickly person, Addison's disease. And these were all things that were kept from the public. These were things kept secret from the public. It explains why, for instance, a lot of people today will want to know the medical records of a presidential candidate, for instance, because of that reality. It turned out to be the closest election since 1888. So there were a lot of controversy about this election. And in fact, it's pretty well known that in the city of Chicago, for instance, the party boss there, Mayor Daley, literally counted dead voters as Kennedy voters. And there was also a lot of anomalies in Texas, where the Democratic Party was known to quite literally stuff ballot boxes. And the election difference, as you can see, was a mere 100,000 vote difference for the entire country. There were people in the Nixon campaign who wanted desperately for him to challenge the results of those elections, and he refused, saying that there was no way that he wanted to be president under those circumstances because people would question the validity of his election or see it as quote-unquote sour grapes. And so he did this by quite literally introducing a new concept, what he would call his new frontier. So in his inaugural speech, he talked about how the torch was being passed to, quote, a new generation of Americans. And Kennedy, I believe, correctly perceived that the baby boomers that we talked about in the previous chapter were now coming of age. They were going to hitting the 21 years of age, which at the time was voting age. And they needed a purpose. They needed something to rally around. For his generation, it was World War II and the Depression, right? So for Kennedy's generation, they knew what it meant. They knew how much power could be produced when you rally around a cause and everybody sort of like comes together. So you hear his clarion call to the American people to ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And he's going to inspire a lot of people, particularly college-age people, to dedicate themselves to public service. So in that election, John F. Kennedy quite literally had zero resume for the job. Nixon had been the vice president of the United States for 8 years in what was considered to be a very successful administration. Nixon was not liked by Eisenhower, and Eisenhower in 1960 was conspicuous in his silence. He never denigrated Nixon, but at the same time, he never really cheerleaded for Nixon. And this, the Nixon people very much resented it, as did a lot of people in what we would today call the right wing of the Republican Party. And so, but really what really comes to play here is the power of television. It's the first, election influenced by that media. And so what happens, there are a series of debates between the two candidates. They were broadcast both on television and on radio. Polling of those audiences showed something rather interesting. Those who watched the debates on television gave the nod to Kennedy, and those who listened to the debates on the radio gave the nod to Nixon. And so what we find is that there's really not too awful much difference between them. So the post-war consensus was still embraced by both the candidates. Both Kennedy and Nixon embraced the idea that domestic politics would be governed by the Keynesian model of economics, and foreign policy would be based on a theory of containment, containing communism. And so when we look at the voting records of Kennedy and Nixon, they're remarkably similar. And again, it's a reflection of this post-war consensus that, so long as everybody stayed within those boundaries, it was acceptable political behavior, regardless of what party you were in. And so Kennedy definitely demonstrates the power of television, the power of image over substance. And again, the election was very, very tight. So the new administration was a very young one. And he had a group of Harvard graduates, similar to FDR's brain trust, that the media called the best and the brightest. This included some of the big figures of the time, Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, Averell Harriman. There are all these different Harvard crowd, or as LBJ called them, the Harvards, who were going to basically surround Kennedy and give him their advice. They were a new and younger group of leaders. They had done pretty remarkable things in the private sector or in academia, and were now offering their services to the country. And a lot of people felt that bode a great deal of promise for the country. The Kennedy record, however, is really rather slim. And That's in part because he dies, right? He's assassinated in 1963, and this cuts his life drastically short, and so, it's very difficult in the second year of his term to basically make a complete judgment of his academic record. But there is something to be said about one of the biggest shortcomings of the Kennedy record, and that is his failure to fully utilize his vice president. So in order for Kennedy to secure the nomination for the Democratic Party, he needed a Southern Democrat. One of his opponents in the primaries was Senator Lyndon Johnson from Texas. As you can see, it's a very big southern state in terms of electoral votes. And Lyndon Johnson had been the majority leader of the Senate. And if you study American government, you would find that the majority leader of the Senate is really the most powerful position in Washington, D.C. He alone gets to decide which pieces of legislation get on the calendar for debate. It doesn't matter how many senators are in favor of it. If the majority leader doesn't want it to see the light of day, it does not see the light of day. And Johnson was famous, if not infamous, on the Hill for his skills at getting legislation done, something referred to as the Johnson treatment. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And the fact of the matter is that the Kennedy administration, from his brother Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General of the United States, even though he had never practiced law, and all of the quote-unquote Harvards that were in positions of authority and policy influence, they all basically resented Johnson. They saw him as a Southern yokel who was sort of a non-intellectual and backward kind of a guy. They openly mocked him. They talked down to him in a very condescending manner. There's a great new books that have come out on Johnson recently, just besides the Doris Kearns Goodman piece that was way long ago now. But what we find is that Johnson was openly mocked by the people. And this is a mistake. It's a mistake because Kennedy had leapfrogged over a lot of other candidates in the Democratic Party to get the nomination. And there was a lot of resentment for that. And some of those people were still in the Congress. And even though the Democrats controlled both houses, no one felt compelled to help the Kennedy agenda if it wasn't going to help them or the party. And that's tough. That's a very tough wall to break through. Johnson could have gotten through it. And in fact, when we talk about the Kennedy record, pretty much any significant legislation that Kennedy had under consideration really only got passed after his death. And it had a lot to do with the Johnson treatment, with Lyndon Johnson as president, going up to the Hill or calling people down from the Hill and getting things done. And that's just unfortunately the reality of it. And so the inability or the unwillingness of the Kennedy administration to utilize Lyndon Johnson as this legislative bulwark is really, in my opinion, the biggest criticism I would have of the Kennedy record. They chose him as the vice president, and then they tried to make him sort of disappear and become sort of a dressing for Southern Democrats. Now, we also see during this time period the continuation of the Warren Court. So Earl Warren will remain Chief Justice until 1969, when he's replaced by Warren Burger. And so we see some major decisions that come down from this period of time. My first one is actually written incorrectly, if I remember right. Yeah, it should be Engel versus Vitale. Vitale worked for the state of New York. This is 1963, and it's the decision of the court that states cannot write a prayer for schools, for children in public schools. Now, Engel was Jewish and came to school only to see his son, sitting in a prayer position with other students, reciting a Christian prayer. And obviously this would be offensive, and the court ruled that states cannot do this. Now, this is the beginning of a very long melodrama about this issue. And there are a lot of conservatives still today who talk about how Engel versus Vitale took God out of the school. And that's, if you read the decision of the court, it really has nothing to do with that whatsoever. This was a very narrowly decided opinion of the court that said that the state cannot draft a prayer and then compel children to pray it. There's nothing in the decision that says that kids can't pray at school. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. But this is the beginning of what a lot of conservatives like Reagan and Newt Gingrich, and then later on people like Donald Trump will talk about how the beginning of tearing down schools and all these other things. Now, Gideon v. Wainwright is a decision that comes out of Florida. Gideon was a man suspected of robbery, and he was convicted in a Florida court, and because he couldn't afford an attorney, he had to represent himself. And this was because the state of Florida did not believe that they had a responsibility to provide him with counsel. Because in this case, it was considered a petty crime. He wasn't serving severe time in prison or significant fines, and therefore it did not violate the Florida Constitution. So Gideon appealed a paupery, which means that he, as a poor person, right? And so he quite literally, if I remember correctly, wrote in pencil on the back of a piece of paper an appeal to the Supreme Court to hear his case. And they agreed. And they agreed with him. The ruling basically stated that the state of Florida and all the states are, quote unquote, incorporated into the federal Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Meaning that because of the 14th Amendment, which means that all of us have to be afforded due process of law, part of that due process is that we have to have proper counsel, an attorney. And so the court decided that the Sixth Amendment of the Bill of Rights, which are rights of the accused, have to apply to the states just like they do to the federal government. And so Gideon was retried and was provided an attorney. And so the follow-up there, which was probably the one that most people recognize out of hand, 1967, is the Miranda v. Arizona case. Miranda was arrested. He gave verbal testimony, let's say, to police before he knew that he didn't have to talk to the police, what's referred to as the Fifth Amendment, or the right to remain silent. And that evidence that he voluntarily gave was used against him in a court of law, which found him convicted and sent to prison. The Supreme Court said that Arizona cannot do that. Again, this is incorporation. The states have to obey the federal constitutional rights to the Fifth Amendment. And Miranda was retried without that evidence, something called the exclusionary rule. All that evidence was excluded from the new trial, but other evidence produced by the prosecution did put Miranda into prison. But the standard is now set. Somebody who's a suspect has to be, in a sense, warned that they have certain rights. And this is what we now refer to as the Miranda rights, the Miranda warning, right? You have a right to remain silent, and everything you say or do can be used against a court of law, things like that. So this is a very important decision. And this sort of rounds out the Warren Court as we get to the end of the 1960s. In foreign policy, there were a lot of early setbacks for Kennedy. So when he came into office, he learned about a plan to arm Cuban refugees and return them to Cuba and have them overthrow Castro. The plan, which landed Cubans at the Bay of Pigs, was ultimately a total failure. And the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion gets a lot of historical attention for really a couple of reasons. But ultimately, I think it's important to realize that the Bay of Pigs invasion was a CIA plan, covert operation, that started under Eisenhower. And Eisenhower continued with the policy or putting through the program because, in my opinion, he assumed that Nixon would probably win. When Nixon did not win, he had an obligation to divulge it to the Kennedy administration during what's referred to as the transition period. So none of that is on Kennedy at all, and it shouldn't be. People can be very conveniently omissive of certain information, and that's one of them. This was a program started under Eisenhower, and it was probably ill-conceived from the beginning. It relied on refugees who fled Cuba because they were part of the problem in Cuba, right? So anyhow, Kennedy decides to continue with it because, again, he embraced the concept of containment and this post-war consensus on that issue. Where he goes wrong, again, in my opinion, is he decides to remove the air cover that the Americans were going to provide to these refugees when they would launch their attack. And he did it for the reason that he didn't want there to be overt proof that the operation was, in a sense, sponsored by the United States. He wanted it to seem more like a Cuban grassroots revolution against Castro, or so you should say counter-revolution to Castro. And so, Kennedy makes this decision. We get an experience that's historians refer to as groupthink. It was a young administration. Kennedy was very bold and assertive. Even when he wasn't quite sure of himself, he still would sound very decisive and very powerful. There was the perception that he was incredibly brilliant and intellectual when, in fact, I would argue that he was a rather shallow person. And so, for instance, his Pulitzer Prize-winning book was basically written by somebody else. Nobody wanted to be that guy in the room that questioned Kennedy. They believed in him. They wanted everybody to be a team player. They wanted to be part of this system. And they didn't want to be the guy that sort of sort of wrecked the buzz. And so everybody got on board, even though some people had real problems with the idea. And it's a disaster. And Kennedy has to go out there and just sort of admit. And this gave the impression that Kennedy was indecisive, that he was sort of really not strong on foreign policy. So when he goes to Vienna to meet Khrushchev 2 months after that, he gets bullied. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. I mean, Khrushchev just absolutely went after him and threatened Kennedy, because he was so inexperienced, or at least in Khrushchev's mind. When Kennedy gets back from Vienna, he called up the Army Reserve and the National Guard. And the Soviet Union responded by erecting the Berlin Wall that divided East and West Berlin. And this crisis in 1961, the Berlin crisis, really becomes the symbol of the Cold War, right? The Berlin Wall was the symbol of the Cold War, and it truly was. I mean, speaking just for myself, I was an exchange student to Germany, which at the time was West Germany in 1980. And, that wall was there, and there was just never the idea that wall would ever disappear. That's how strong it was. But Kennedy makes the decision to go to Berlin, and it's a critical one. And so Kennedy goes to West Berlin, and you have to imagine that from the West Berliners' perspective, the wall was seen as just step one of what would probably become total Soviet encirclement of the city of Berlin. And they were terrified. They were terrified that they were literally going to be engulfed into East Germany, which surrounded West Berlin, and that they would become doomed like so many of their relatives and friends who were on the other side of that wall. And so when the president arrived, he wanted to communicate both to the people of West Berlin and the people of West Germany and the Soviet Union that whatever happened to these West Berliners was happening to the entire Western Alliance, and by continuation, the United States. And he completed his speech that's filled with this imagery of all of us being on the same page by saying, Ich bin ein Berliner, which basically means I am a man from Berlin. And there's all sorts of jokes about what it really meant or whether he was grammatically correct and all this other garbage that goes with it. But essentially, the people of Berlin cheered. You can go today to JFK Avenue in Germany, in Berlin, because the president was making it very clear that any attempt to attack West Berlin was going to be an attack on the United States. Another symbol of brinksmanship. So what happens? The failed attack on Cuba led Castro to believe that he was about to be invaded. And so he appealed directly to Khrushchev for assistance, and Khrushchev agreed to put missiles on the island of Cuba. So in 1962, U.S. Spy planes, U-2 planes, caught aerial photographs of these silos being built and the fuselages for these missiles that were not ready to operate, but in the process of being installed. And so JFK placed a blockade around Cuba, not allowing anything in or out until the missiles were removed. There was a lot of back channel work here. And on October 24th, the Soviet ships stopped short of the quarantine line, turned around, and the missiles were removed. Now, Bobby Kennedy at the time made a point of saying, "There, look, see, Khrushchev blinked, right? Put that in your papers, right? Khrushchev blinked." But the reality is, Kennedy did a typical quid pro quo. The U.S. had nuclear weapons stationed in Turkey, and we agreed to remove those missiles if if Khrushchev removed the missiles from Cuba, and that was the deal that was made. Yes, the Soviets both backed down and turned around and basically took the missiles away from Cuba. But we accommodated the Russians as well. So it's not quite exactly as Bobby Kennedy wanted it portrayed. And when it comes to Vietnam, we have a major point of escalation. Now, I have a narrative on Vietnam that goes all the way back to 1921. And a number of what I refer to as red flags, just sort of incidences and positions in the Vietnam narrative that should have been telling the United States, get out, let it alone, don't get involved. And Kennedy's position in 1963 is very indicative of that. So what happens is that the United States had been supporting the South Vietnamese regime either directly or indirectly since 1945. And so when Kennedy took over, there were several hundred military advisors in South Vietnam helping the South Vietnamese regime to fight back the North, either the Viet Minh Army of North Vietnam or the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. And so now the premier of South Vietnam was a guy named Diem, was a very corrupt president. He was combative. He was what I would refer to as a very reactionary Catholic. He goes out after Buddhists in Vietnam, which was the majority of people in Vietnam, and he was not helping in terms of winning the quote-unquote hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. And so the Viet Cong was rising in popularity. And now, all of that has nothing to do with John F. Kennedy. What happens, however, is when their military commanders for South Vietnam communicated to Kennedy excuse me, communicated to Kennedy through the CIA that they needed to get rid of DM. The DM was really a problem. And so Kennedy sort of gives what I would just sort of say as a flippant kind of, it's your government, kind of thing. And in the fall of 1963, there was a coup against the DM regime. And not only did they get rid of him, but they murdered him. And to me, that's a very big red flag, because prior to that event, the United States was really perceived as having been put in a position to fix French policy, right? Because it was part of the French Empire. But once we had a hand in destroying a regime and replacing it with somebody else, that's when I believe it became our war and our problem. And so this is a big problem. There are some documented evidence that Kennedy wanted to fix that, to reverse it. Robert McNamara has implied that there were conversations and communications that Kennedy was going to pull out of Vietnam. I don't give a whole lot of credence to that, but it doesn't really matter, because a few months later, in November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. And this is a really difficult event for me to talk about, because I grew up in a household where John F. Kennedy was basically worshipped. Most of my family were blue-collar workers. More than half of them were Catholics. And, John F. Kennedy just was an amazingly aspirational person. And in fact, I would argue he gives his most amazing speeches are the Two Americas speech that he gives on television following some of the civil rights demonstrations, where he tells the American people that we can no longer live in a country with two sets of rules, one for most people and another set of rules for people who happen to be black. He really had a way of inspiring people. So growing up, I had a very, idealistic vision of who Kennedy was. And so that was always a problem. But the second is that his assassination is so riddled with conspiracy theories and Hollywoodization that it's impossible to get to the truth. And so I just sort of talk about how it's critical in the narrative of the United States, and that is, to date, it's the last of the what's referred to as the accidental presidents, right? It's in the midst of the Cold War, and the one thing that we do know and did know right away, Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist. He had lived in the Soviet Union. He had gone to Cuba. He had aspired to helping the communist system. He was in the United States again, but he was still aspiring to turn America into a communist government. And so there were perceptions that this could have, in fact, been a Cuban/Soviet backed assassination. Lyndon Johnson and the people closest to him in the security regime felt it was really critical to have the perception that there was somebody in charge, that there wasn't a constitutional crisis in the United States. And we get this very macabre and sad picture of Lyndon Johnson being sworn in as president with Mrs. Kennedy standing next to him, still in the outfit she wore when he was assassinated, his blood, and more importantly, the president's body in a casket directly behind them on Air Force One. It's a situation that has drawn a lot of conversations in historical circles, but it is still a very sour point within the Kennedy camp, if you will. And Lyndon Johnson is at the center of a lot of these conspiracy theories, and in part because of this this event that takes place on Air Force One. So when we talk about civil rights, right, what happens is we get a shift, right? The Martin Luther King's group, which was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, teamed up with students, referred to the SNCC, the Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so African Americans continue to protest the inequality of society. When 4 African American college students sat at a whites-only counter and refused to move, the concept of a sit-in was born. So in 1961, to test a federal order banning segregation of buses, a group of students went on what were referred to as the Freedom Rides. And I think it's really important to understand how strategic and purposeful these events were. The sit-ins did not happen at some random place. These were at Woolworths. Now, Woolworths still exists. It's a drugstore chain, similar to CVS. But when you went inside, there was the regular grocery store drugstore that you would think of today. But off to the side would be these lunch counters, right? They served, light meals, right? A diner type of setup. Well, this was a chain. They were all over the United States. And the issue that was being emphasized here is, if a black man went to a Woolworths in Chicago, they would be served. But in Biloxi, Mississippi, or Birmingham, Alabama, they weren't. So doing this got these issues on the front page. These pictures are in the papers. The videos are on the television program. And it forced Americans to face these dramatic inconsistencies and these clear evidence of racial hypocrisy. The same with the buses. These were not just random buses that they decided to get on and ride through the South. These were Greyhound buses. These were, nationally chartered transportation companies that had no problem giving black people a ride on the bus in certain places, but they don't want to give them a bus ride in the South. And that's not acceptable. And so the Freedom Riders were brutalized. The picture that you see here happened when Freedom Riders were at a station where they were harassed and attacked by KKK people. And while they were there, KKK people punched holes in the tires of the bus so that once the bus was on the highway again, the tires would go flat. And when the bus pulled over, the KKK guys drove by and hurled firebombs into the bus. People were inside. And they set the bus on fire. And what's interesting is that these buses had marshals on them. And so what we see and what's different here, and I think this is the key to the protests and the passive resistance, is that the federal government finally makes the decision that they are going to enforce the 14th Amendment in the South. Ever since 1869, when the 14th Amendment was drafted, there had been a lot of obfuscation and just downright negligence on the part of the federal government to actually enforce the 14th Amendment through something called incorporation. There's evidence that U.S. Grant tried to do things. He arrests almost 3,000 people in the South for violating due process for black people in the South. But it's very irregular. And by the time we get to the 1960s, most governments at the national level or administrations are openly trying to ignore it for a variety of reasons, including the Kennedy administration. But this is when most Americans are like, yeah, you know what? That's not enough, right? So on May 15th, the white mob in Alabama assaulted a Freedom bus. And that's when, the proverbial, shit hits the fan. I mean, people were just like fed up. And even Americans who probably didn't even know a black person, were outraged at this sort of thing. So a really good exercise to do is to look at this, right? Eugene Bull Connor, right? His nickname was Bull, right? There with the glasses, unleashes dogs on civil rights demonstrators. And what's important to look at is to look at the people in the picture. They're not wearing sneakers and gym shorts, or they're not there in like cutoffs and sloppy clothes. They're in there with nice shirts. This gentleman here is obviously very clean shaven. He has a nice pair of shoes on, right? And so he is, if you look at all of the black individuals in that picture, there's not a single one of them that is demonstrating any form of hostility whatsoever towards the police, towards each other, towards the dogs. There's absolutely nothing in that photograph that would lead you to believe that there was any kind of provocation on the part of the people demonstrating. This was a peaceful demonstration by law-abiding, middle-class people. That's the key to the success there, right? This is the key to the success of that movement. The United States was living under two sets of laws. And when the average American saw that and was confronted by it, they realized something had to be done, right? So August 28th, 1963, the famous I Have a Dream speech, right? The Freedom Summer, voter registration drives in the South to get blacks registered to vote so that they could, exercise their rights as citizens of the United States, and then the March on Washington. So Robert Moses was an African-American and Harvard-educated New Yorker. He led a march on Mississippi's capital to protest that state's denial of rights to voters. His group's subsequent actions would lead to a revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the South. But it's going to lead the United States to the Voting Rights Act, right? So civil rights laws get passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Notice the date. This is Lyndon Johnson. This is not Kennedy. Kennedy gives the clarion call, right? The famous speech on television. But to get it through the Congress, and that's what's so important, right? Those Southern Democrats had to be brought in line. And that John F. Kennedy never would have been able to do that, in my opinion. But Johnson could, and Johnson did. And he followed up this, right? So the Civil Rights Act of 64 was about equal access to public facilities, to the idea of equal access to opportunity. And then it's followed up a year later with the Voting Rights Act. And this made it illegal to disenfranchise any voter. This is going to be followed up with the 24th Amendment. And the 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. And this was the main mechanism that Southern states used to disenfranchise black voters. They had to prove that they paid property taxes in order to vote. If they couldn't do that, they could get the vote by passing a literacy test. And so for most African Americans at the time, that was a crapshoot. And then they had things like grandfather laws. So there's all these different things that were done revolving around these poll taxes. The 24th Amendment outlawed that. Disenfranchising people is a constitutional violation, not just a little one. So there's going to be the summer violence, racial violence in 1966, referred to as the Long Hot Summer. And we begin to see expressions of what's referred to as Black Power. This is a photograph, of course, of Malcolm X. And it takes different forms. There's Black Power expressed through the Black Panthers. Now, this was the SNCC that basically kicked out all of the white college members and sort of broke their connection with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Stokely Carmichael, and others that just became fed up with waiting. And so, in addition, there was a cultural pride movement, and this isn't exactly like the Harlem Renaissance, because it's a lot more vocal and demonstrative, and I would almost say like evangelical in its execution. But artists such as James Brown, right, making some very popular music at the time, Jimi Hendrix and others that were just out there going, look, this is, I'm black and I'm proud to be black, and this is what it means to be black. We're going to have the famous 1968 Olympics where black American track stars put up a black gloved fist in protest, right? Now, this is going to start what's sometimes referred to as African American studies or black studies. Most colleges will have these still today to actually look into and discuss what it means to be black in America and the different experiences, the black experience in American history and literature, art, and what have you. Now, Malcolm X is a very different narrative. He comes out of the vein that we've talked about before. It started by Booker T. Washington, this sort of idea that white America was always going to have an element of racism in it, and that the only way to change that was to create vibrant black communities that depended on each other and were successful and prosperous and talented, and that hopefully in the future sometime white America would see these vibrant communities and be like, why are we in two separate groups? So Malcolm was part of what was called the Nation of Islam, started by Elijah Muhammad. And this has a lot of the black pride element to it and black studies concepts. This is an Islamic group, obviously Muslim group, that has some philosophical issues with Christianity and race and all the different things. And they believed in black-run communities and black-empowered communities. And the idea that, to sort of, in a sense, reject white power, privilege, and position. And Malcolm X was one of Elijah Muhammad's proteges, really sort of being groomed to take over. He and Louis Farrakhan. And his speeches were inflammatory and very confrontational. But so just the idea of Malcolm X, right? He was actually born with the last name Brown. He changed it to X because the X symbolized his real last name that was stolen from him by white people, right? Technically, the master, right? The slave owner deprived him of his name, and so. He is this very direct, fiery person, and he rejected Martin Luther King's methodology because he saw white society as inherently racist, and there was just no way to fix that, so better to just get away from them. Now, he goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca, what's referred to as the Hajj, and while he's there, he meets with a number of Muslim clerics, and they give him what I'm going to call a conversion, and to seeing just how important it was to reach across race lines and party lines and all this other stuff to come to a peaceful resolution of difference rather than trying to incite people to violence. And he comes back with this conversion message. And this is going to put him in direct conflict with the Nation of Islam. And he is assassinated by rival faction of the Black Muslims in 1964. And I am one of the historians who believe that Louis Farrakhan ordered that assassination. He, of course, still to this day vehemently denies it. I just think that there's a lot of historical evidence that says otherwise. Now, Lyndon Johnson, as I had said earlier, he'd been added to the ticket with Kennedy to balance it in terms of two things. Regional, Johnson was from the South, which Kennedy needed, but also Kennedy had virtually no experience. And Johnson had loads of that in terms of legislative work. He continued Kennedy's domestic program, and through his leadership had most of it passed, right? So in 1964, he announced a war on poverty. And so it's inspired by a 1961 book by Michael Harrington called The Other America. And you may remember back when we did the Gilded Age, or when you studied the Gilded Age, there was a man referred to as the father of the muckrakers, Jacob Riis, who wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. And in it, he describes the abject poverty of urban environments. And Michael Harrington was called the Jacob Riis of the 60s. And his book, The Other America, was basically a chronicle of how the other half lives in the country, the poor half. He was able to demonstrate about 20% of the American people were living in poverty towards the end of the 1950s. And what he wanted to do, Johnson believed that ending poverty was the key, right? And that the United States, and again, this is where Johnson is going to show that he's a true sort of New Dealer at heart. This is the idea that comes from the progressive agenda, that the federal government is a positive agent of change, and that if the government were to sort of zero in its focus and to apply the right amount of intervention and money, that they could, in a sense, eradicate poverty. And so what LBJ called his war on poverty is referred to as the Great Society program. And up until the current date, we've spent approximately $22 trillion, a lot of that borrowed money, to get that poverty rate down. And I'll let you do the studies on that to decide whether that was effective or not. But in the election of 1964, Johnson runs against Barry Goldwater, referred to during his lifetime as Mr. Conservative. He is nominated for that post by Ronald Reagan in the 1964 Republican convention. And so what happens is he wins decisively, 61% of the vote, which is really not common at all. So in 1965, then, he gets Congress to approve Medicare program. He gets health insurance which is health insurance for the elderly. He's going to get about 435 bills through the Congress, all revolving around ending poverty. In addition, in 1965, he's going to sign a new Immigration Act. And for those of you who live where I am, which is in California, or anywhere along the border states, you're going to feel the effects of this. And it's really quite interesting. The purpose behind this act in 1965 was to get rid of something called the quota system. Started in the 1920s, this was the idea that you could sort of restrict who gets into the country based on their ethnic background. And in the context of civil rights and poverty, this was very contradictory to that message. And so the United States decides to get rid of the quota system. So what's interesting about the quota system, however, is that no matter how strict the quotas got, Canada and Latin America were exempt from these quotas. So the United States, really since the Bracero agreements and even before that, had what I would refer to as a relatively open border. It was seasonal in nature. A lot of people came up from Mexico primarily to work at harvest time, and then they would go back to Mexico for the rest of the period of time. It was a rather fluid thing. The Immigration Act of 1965, passed by a Democrat and a Democratic Congress, got rid of the quota system, but then implemented caps on the total number of visas that would be issued by the United States and placed all foreigners under the same system. And what that meant was, for the first time ever, Latin Americans were going to have to wait in line like everyone else to get their visa. And this is going to cause, in my opinion, a major element of what we today call illegal immigration crisis. Now, the Great Society programs are, again, I'll leave it up to you to decide. The numbers are not very positive if you look at them. Like I've said, we spent well over $22 trillion on Great Society programs. Unemployment poverty rates in 1965 were about 19%. Some say it was as low as 17. Today, it's about the same. It's about 16, 17%. There's some figures that are showing that's gone down quite a bit recently, which kind of surprises me. But anyway, it's a lot of money. I'm not sure that we necessarily got the right amount of bang for our buck. But now, one of the reasons that some historians say that the Great Society didn't work is that LBJ inherited a policy of preventing communism and into China. He didn't see any reason to save Vietnam, but since the United States was already committed, he didn't see a way to get himself out of it. And again, LBJ appeared on television and informed the American public in 1964 that the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy had been fired on by North Vietnamese vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin, right? So what becomes known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, or Johnson's blank check, right? Congress passed a resolution authorizing the president to take all necessary steps to repel attacks against U.S. forces. And by March of 1965, combat troops start to enter Vietnam, what some people refer to as the Vietnamization of the war, or the Americanization of the war. And now, this has to be seen in the context of containment. Johnson becomes obsessed. He knew Truman. He believed confidently that Truman's failure to stop the fall of China to communism, and in fact his sort of tie in Korea, were reasons why Truman decided not to run for election again in 1952. And Johnson was obsessed with not seeming to be weak on communism. At the time, he was planning on running again in 1968. And he didn't want to be seen as weak. And this starts a period of escalation. And the best way that I could talk about this is American involvement, again, goes all the way back to 1945. It's indirect. It gets it gets intensified in 1954 with the Geneva Accords. It gets escalated again in 1963 when Kennedy decides to approve a coup against the South Vietnamese regime. And now in 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. What we're going to find out through what are called the Pentagon Papers, none of that was true. It was a fabrication. And what we know today is that the Johnson administration was basically ill-prepared to execute this policy. Because, again, Johnson really wasn't concerned about the fate of the people of Vietnam. He was concerned more with the political reality of his own ability to be seen as strong against communism. So American escalation, and if you look at it, it's a very long war involvement, but our direct fighting is actually quite narrow. By the end of 1965, we have about 189,000 men on the ground. And within, I think, the next year or two, we have up to 500,000. And so, really, now, what becomes, I think, really important is how we executed the war. And this is where things get fuzzy. So Robert McNamara was inherited from the Kennedy administration. He was the Secretary of Defense. He was the former president of Ford Motors. And he had revived Ford's profitability by using computer technology and basically accounting practices to get into the supply chain and the production chain to find better efficiencies for both products and manufacturing. So Kennedy believed that McNamara could bring those same efficiencies to the Pentagon. So when it came to fighting the war in Vietnam, McNamara decided to use surgical strikes and managed engagement in order to, in a sense, win over the hearts and minds of South Vietnamese and convince the North, as it were, to come to the negotiating table, if that's the way you want to use it. So what happened? The Pentagon would issue a list of objectives every morning The commander on the ground, which is General Westmoreland, would then submit these out to his commanders, and they would have their objective. At the end of the day, they would have to report back to the commanders in the field the rates of their success. How much of their objective was accomplished? Was it 100%, 50%, 75%, 0%? And what their casualty numbers were. All that data would be sent back to Washington, D.C. And so McNamara would run through this with computers. He would get all the statistical data. New objectives would be sent out the next day. And this is how the war was going to be fought. Now, Congress, exercising its oversight, would ask the Pentagon to come in and explain why things were seeming rather stagnant in Vietnam. And if you can imagine, McNamara was able to provide Congress with these very detailed spreadsheets demonstrating that the United States was meeting easily 75% of their objectives every single day. And this is really, in my opinion, the explanation as to why we escalate so fast. Because he was able to ask the Congress, well, look, if you gave me 50,000 more guys, I could be doing this, right? And so we go from 150,000 to 500,000 within a couple of years. And Americans are being told by their government that we were winning the war, that the North had nothing to come back with us. And it was just a matter of time. We were winning and the North was losing. The North couldn't do anything to us. And then January of 1968, we get what's referred to as the Tet Offensive. Tet is a holiday in Southeast Asia. It's the New Year celebration. And in January 1968, the idea of a quagmire, right, really becomes the main narrative. The North invades the South in a coordinated attack with Viet Cong people who were in the South. The physical objectives of that attack were never accomplished. And that's really important to know. As a military operation, it's a failure. However, the psychological effect was staggering. For Americans, right, the American public viewed it as a tremendous loss. And so LBJ's popularity is going to decline by 35%. A leading American news anchor, Walter Cronkite, will actually go to Vietnam and do this report. And in it, he just basically says, look, this is a war that can't be won and it should not be fought. LBJ is watching this with his staff, and he turns to them and says, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost America. And it's important to realize that 1968 was an election year, and he had to come to terms with the fact that he just wasn't going to do it. And he withdraws from the race in 1968 in what's referred to as the Year of Revolution, right? So LBJ and the protesters, again, right, if Johnson had, in a sense, stayed out of active deployment, he could have been perceived as, the guy who had to help fix what Kennedy did, which would have been a legitimate thing for him to say. But by escalating the war, the protesters now came on him. So when you see anti-war demonstration footage or videos, you're really looking at a very narrow period of time, 1964 to 1970. This is the most intense period of the anti-war protests, and it's because of the escalating numbers of young men that are actually being sent to the war. So 1968 is a very traumatic year. As I said, some people call it the Year of Revolution. There's a number of documentaries that you can watch. CNN did one. The History Channel also did one on that year alone. The student protests become absolutely violent. This is the Students for Democratic Society, SDS, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. Martin Luther King is assassinated in April of 1968. And then Robert Kennedy, who had become a candidate for president in 1968, is assassinated in June. This posed a very unique situation here. Bobby Kennedy hated Lyndon Johnson, and he resigns as Attorney General and he runs for the Senate seat in New York. And he was prepared to wait it out. At the time, I'm sure he considered it Lyndon Johnson's election to win or to lose, and he would not want to be perceived as damaging the chances of LBJ to win re-election. So what happens? Lyndon Johnson gets challenged for the nomination of the Democratic Party by a guy named Eugene McCarthy. And McCarthy became very famous and very popular on college campuses because he was the peace Democrat. He was going to go in there and he promised to get out of the war. Done. No other conversations. So what happens is the Tet Offensive occurs, and when Johnson realizes he can't win and he pulls out, his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, takes over the mantle. And this is when RFK decides that he has a chance to get in there and win this nomination. And because he's much more photogenic and much more articulate and much more inspirational to any other candidates, he quickly starts to take over. And he wins the largest electoral state in the primaries, which of course is California. And in a speech in Los Angeles hotel, he calls for his delegates to go and now we're gonna take on the convention. This was a horrific live footage of another Kennedy being assassinated in the basement of this hotel. Sirhan, who was a Palestinian terrorist, in my opinion, decided that he would protest American support for Israel by killing a Kennedy. And so the question then became, where do Robert Kennedy's peace delegates go when we get to the convention, which is going to be held in Chicago? And the Democratic Party was clearly very divided. And the Students for Democratic Society announced that they would be in Chicago to protest this war policy of the Democratic Party. Mayor Daley, who's still the party boss there, who counted dead people for Kennedy, tells SDS they better stay out of his city because he's going to, crack some heads. And and Richard Daley does this. He orders 20,000 police and National Guardsmen to keep order. And when they couldn't, anxious reporters broadcast the riots across the nation. I mean, it was just live footage of this absolutely horrific situation. And so there was violent scenes live on television, and it's something that I think for younger audiences hard to understand. But at the time, there were literally 4 channels. There was ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS. And PBS was in its infancy, really. And so, the television actually turned off at night. You would get this broadcast, single image with a beeping, that just said, go to bed because there's nothing else on television. But when the conventions happened, they had gavel to gavel coverage every single day. And the Democratic convention was going to prove interesting because it was what we call a brokered convention. And what happens, or I should say what becomes immediately clear, is that while there was a debate inside the hall about who should be the nominee for the party, in the back rooms of the hall, the party bosses were basically conniving a way for Hubert Humphrey to win the nomination, even though there was a sizable group of Democrats who did not want that to happen. And there were literally fistfights on the floor of the convention. All this broadcast live. Outside, you had demonstrators being cracked skulls, bleeding all over the place, people chanting, "The whole world is watching," which of course they were. I mean, it was just an amazing scene of violence and division and hatred. In Miami, however, Richard Nixon, the former vice president, arrives in what's really a United Miami convention. And he taps into a third-party candidate, George Wallace, who runs as an independent. Now, George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, who came out violently against ending segregation in the South, famously saying, segregation now, segregation forever. he launched a third-party candidacy in 1968 based on what he called law and order. That these protesters, these civil rights activists were agitators. They were upsetting the balance. People no longer felt safe. And Nixon's going to tap into that. What's going to be referred to as the Southern strategy, which I'll get into detail in the next chapter probably, is this idea of, do you feel safe? And is this the kind of America you want to go into? Because Nixon tapped into what he calls the silent majority. And this is an interesting concept. What I believe, if you study it, would help to explain a lot of the Trump attraction in the current political environment that we're in. And that is that a lot of Americans just want to kind of like live their life. Like they want to they get up every day, they pay their bills, they eat their breakfast, they take care of the kids, they go to work, they come home, they run their errands, right? And they kind of just want to be left alone. So while we like to study the protesters because they're more interesting, or the sort of like the hippies and the revolutionaries and the counterculture, the fact of the matter is they were the minority. And a lot of people by 1968 were kind of sick of it. They just didn't want to do it anymore. And while they weren't the type of people to go out and demonstrate, they weren't the kind of people to go out and yell and scream, hence silent. On election day, however, they go and vote. And the results are really pretty clear. It was a very clear victory for Nixon in the Electoral College. If you note, however, there's only a 500,000 vote difference between Nixon and Humphrey. And had Wallace not been in the race, there may have been a difference in some key states. So, and by the way, Wallace runs again in 1972, and he's shot during the campaign. He has what he calls a born-again experience while he's in a coma. And he comes out, and I have to say, it's one of the most remarkable stories in politics. He is completely changed. Not only is he no longer for segregation, he gets reelected as governor of Alabama. He starts multiple programs to increase opportunities for blacks in the South. He mobilizes an entire voting bloc of black Democratic voters. I mean, he really becomes this phenomenal champion for blacks in the South. And right before he passes away, I'm blanking out on the date, but the Urban League, which is one of the leading civil rights organizations in the country, gives him what they call their Lifetime Achievement Award for what he has done. So it's never too late to be a better person. And with that note, we'll finish our conversation about the 1960s.